Hey everybody, we're back and we're continuing on with the Mazzaroth series. Today we are starting the Mazzaroth series of Aries, and I would say technically we started that about a week and a half ago when we celebrated Passover at home in our fellowship, because the Passover this year was when Aries actually began. It was coincided with the astronomical sign of the sun rising in the constellation of Aries. Now, the story of Aries, or let's call it the chapter in the story of God that Aries represents Christ in his human incarnation as the Lamb of God and all of the things that entails. Now, I want to show you what the morning sky looked like looking east from Jerusalem in the morning, and this is what it's looked like pretty much for the past week and a half or so. You can see there on the screen that the sun has just recently moved out of the boundaries of the two fish, or the story of Pisces, which we just concluded, and it's now beginning to rise in the constellation of Aries. And it will continue to do so over a period of several weeks, but as it rises, it will get further and further away from where it is right there, as you see it on the screen, more towards the head of the Lamb, and then going towards the back feet, and eventually will pass in to the next Mazzaroth sign in the next chapter in the story of God, which is going to be Taurus. So, as we closed out our Pisces study and the Babylonian captivity, I mentioned that we have a study on the life of Christ that is on our Four Winds Fellowship website. And I'm just going to remind anyone who, especially if you've not gone through that study before, it's part of our Bereans Bible Institute. So you can navigate to fourwindsfellowships.net. Click on the tab up top that says BBI, that stands for the Bereans Bible Institute, and then select Module 6. This study on the life of Christ is 30 modules long. It's very, very comprehensive. But we take you through the life of Christ chronologically by harmonizing and integrating the four different gospel accounts and using the Gospel of Luke as a chronological framework, because Luke says in his gospel that his intent was to lay out the events of the life of Christ in chronological order. It's an excellent study, and so as we go through the sign or the chapter of Aries in the story of God, I'm not going to try to reinvent that. What I want to do is pick up on a couple of themes, recurring and critical themes, that we've been building in the whole Story of God series over especially the last few Mazzaroth signs, and that's this idea of inspection. And we're going to go through what was happening in the world at the time of Christ, but particularly we're going to build some history. This is, hopefully this particular lesson and the next one will be as interesting for you as it has been for me, because we're going to go through the history of the world that led into the world that Jesus was born into at the time when he came to earth. The story of Aries as the Lamb of God can't simply be shortened to Jesus died for your sins. Well, I guess it could be, and it usually is, but that does this chapter of the story of God a grave injustice. I want you to go to Luke chapter 19, and we saw this, I think it was in the final installment, the final lesson of the Pisces chapter, Luke 19. And I had pointed out actually several lessons ago in Pisces that towards the very end of Christ's ministry, several days before the Passover, in fact it was 5 days before the Passover, Jesus was preparing to enter into the city. He was riding on a donkey, and people were throwing their cloaks down on the ground in these palm branches, and they're waving the branches, proclaiming, "Hosanna in the highest, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So let's pick up Luke 19 in verse 39, which comes immediately after that statement. "And some of the Pharisees called to him, being Jesus, from the crowd, 'Teacher, rebuke your disciples.' But he answered and said to them, 'I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out.' Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, 'If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation.'" I told you a few lessons ago that this word visitation, where he said the time of your visitation, the Greek word is episkopos, and this is where we get the word episcopal or Episcopalian. And it refers to an official inspection, or in some cases, in context, it might actually refer to like a court proceeding being brought before, say, a magistrate to have your case heard. In either case, the concept of judgment and assessing is integral to the words that Jesus is saying as he's looking out over the city and weeping because he's going into the city and he knows he's on his way to the cross. But why these words and why right here and why right now? Because he could have said the same thing anytime during his ministry. Now, of course, he may have. Like, we only have one record of him saying this. But the reality is that the entire time that he was in ministry, he had his eyes on the Jewish leadership, and he was assessing the job that they were doing the entire time, at least of the time that was recorded through the Gospels. I mean, it certainly could have been before that. Think about where we are here in Luke 19 in the life of Christ, because we're going to end up zooming way back and going back centuries and talking about Alexander the Great here in a moment. But where we are right now with the time of Christ, and he's getting ready to go into the city, he's riding on the donkey. In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, Zechariah says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." And if you want to quickly turn back to Genesis chapter 49, this is Jacob's deathbed blessing. And we've looked at this several times in different contexts throughout this particular study. But Genesis 49 verse 8, where Jacob is talking about Judah and the tribe, and eventually he's talking about the Messiah that will come from Judah. He says in verse 8, "Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from beneath his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the hope of the nations," is the translation from the Greek Septuagint. But notice this in verse 11. "Binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk." Now, I think the imagery is crystal clear here. The king is coming. He's entering into the city under the proclamation, the public announcement, "I am the king." And after centuries of the nation being led by faulty stewards and a can't get my words out today, a corrupt priesthood, we see this triumphal entry of the king. Now, in John's account, in John chapter 12, the day before this happened, Mary had come in when they were eating dinner, and she had anointed his feet with expensive and fragrant oil, and she had wiped them with her hair. So in sequence, one day after the other, we see him being anointed with oil. We see him riding a donkey as prophesied in both Genesis as well as with Zechariah. And we see him being proclaimed king by the people. But what about Christ himself? Well, listen to this in John 12:14. This is what Jesus himself said when he sat on the donkey. And he quotes Isaiah and Zechariah. John 12:15, Jesus' words. He says, "Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." Now, throughout his ministry, Jesus had been asked several times, like, "Oh, if you're the Messiah, tell us." And he kind of always evaded that question, even though he spoke to the Pharisees in cloaked terms and parables. He really was telling them, "I am who I am." But here he was saying it explicitly. He's getting ready to go into the city in a formal capacity. And this goes back to the idea of they did not know the time of their visitation. And at this point, it had been over 600 years since the last good king of Judah, since Josiah. And it had been, in fact, over 6 years between where we are here in the story and when Judah had any king whatsoever. But now the king is returning and court was in session, so to speak. But usually, when there's a court, there are formal charges, and really that's what the entire book of Malachi is about. It's this indictment about the priesthood and challenges from God for them to clean up their act. And of course, that book ends with promising to send Elijah the prophet before the return of the Lord. And I think that's a discussion for a different time, to be honest with you. But right now, what I want to do is I want to zoom back out from an historical perspective and talk about the world that Jesus was born into. Of course, we know that it was under Roman rule, and usually when we read about the life of Christ through the Gospels, we're trapped by the narrow focus of the text itself. Sure, we read names like Herod and Pontius Pilate, and we know that Rome was the governing power, but what was happening in the bigger geopolitical picture? We don't always have that in our mind as we read. And the bigger question really is, does the bigger geopolitical picture have any relevance to the part of the God story that we just finished in the Pisces chapter, and this one here that we're beginning with, the chapter on Aries, is the Lamb of God. Daniel 2, and you can turn there if you want. We're not going to read from Daniel 2, but I just want to point you back to that Daniel chapter 2 is where we see the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and that helps us with some orientation in this big picture. And I'd like you to read that on your own if you're not familiar with it, or if it's just been a long time. Go ahead and read that again. Because in essence, Daniel in this vision and his interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is a prophecy of what I call the March of Nations. It's how we see different empires over a period of time rising to power and then falling as another one rises to power. And it all starts with Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, who is the one who had the dream. Of course, this is the story of Aquarius that we've studied in the past in the first exile of Judah. But 70 years later, after that first exile was over, Cyrus of Persia defeats Nebuchadnezzar's grandson Belshazzar, and he releases the Jews as Jeremiah had predicted. And under the Pisces chapter, which is the story of the return of the Jews, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the city, and that's the Mazzaroth sign that we just completed. But after Babylon, a few kings after King Cyrus, comes Alexander the Great, and he defeated the Persians, and then the Persian Empire fell apart. But Alexander's reign itself was short-lived because he died relatively young. He came to power very young, and he died relatively young as well. And as we have taught before, and is historically known, his kingdom was split into 4 different regions that then coalesced into 2 major regions. And during this period, as we'll come back to later, we see the translation of the Septuagint, we see the Maccabean revolt. But then after the Greek Empire disintegrated, we see the increase of the Roman Empire, or the rise of the Roman Empire. In fact, at that point, it was a Roman Republic. The empire hadn't started yet, but the Roman Republic rose to power and basically crushed the Greeks. And this is the world that Jesus was born into. And it's great to just sit back and kind of map out that very broad-stroked history lesson. But there's a lot more detail, and I think there's a lot more relevance to understanding the history. Now, I will be honest and very transparent. I'm not a historian. In fact, most of my younger years when I was in school, whether it was junior high or high school, I really had no interest in history whatsoever. It wasn't my great subject. And it wasn't until I started to understand the story of God that history then had meaning to me. And it was understanding the context and filling in some of the details of the story of God. And I think it's important. I really do. And I'll say it again. I think understanding history and the history of God and his people is just as important as having correct doctrine. And in fact, I think it's difficult to have correct doctrine in many cases without having that historical understanding. And it's not just the history of the Jewish people and their customs and how they did things. It was the world that they lived in and how that had an impact on the people of God and how they were committed to or not committed to Jehovah and how they worshiped him. But we have some backstory to fill here. We've kind of painted that big picture very, very quickly there. We do have some backstory to fill in. And what I want to do in our study of the Aries chapter is paint that bigger picture, that geopolitical picture, with some more detail. And I want to plug in some names and some dates, at least some loose time frames, of things that are probably familiar to us. Whether it is the Spartans and the Battle of Marathon, or great names like Julius Caesar or Pompey the Great or Philip of Macedon. These are the people and the events that led us right into the story of Aries and the life of Christ. And we've heard these things, but we probably never learned about them, or certainly didn't think about them in the context of the story of God. I do want you to go to Daniel chapter 7 for a moment. Daniel is, I think, particularly useful in a study like this because he gives us three different major insights into this march of nations. And the very first insight, of course, starts with Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this idol, this image. You can see it on the screen there with, the golden head, and you've got the arms and the torso and the belly and the thighs and the legs and then the 10 toes. And again, I'm not going to parse the details of that. Tim has done that several times. He's done it in the Daniel study. He's touched on it in the Revelation study. So we won't go through it again here. So we see the march of nations from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, and ultimately to the Antichrist kingdom, which is a revival of the ancient Roman Empire. But then in Daniel chapter 7, about 6 years after Nebuchadnezzar died and his grandson Belshazzar takes the throne, and to be honest, that might be a little bit of a stretch because Persian records state that Belshazzar was the son of a co-regent named Nabonidus. However, some scholars suggest that Belshazzar was related to Nebuchadnezzar on his mother's side. This is, one of the challenges of studying and trying to integrate history lessons into our study of the Bible is that secular histories are rife with omissions and outright falsehoods. I can't remember who stated it, but there's a very famous saying that says history is written by the victors. However, we have plenty of historical records on both the losing side as well as the victorious side of certain key historical events throughout world history. And sometimes they tell a different tale about people or about what actually happened. So we kind of have to piece things together and make our best guess about what we think is accurate and what we think is true. But nevertheless, 6 years later, after Nebuchadnezzar is dead, this guy named Belshazzar is on the throne. Being the co-regent of this man named Nabonidus, now he has an enigmatic background. We don't really know much about him other than he's probably more closely related ethnically to the ancient Assyrians than the Chaldeans, which was the ethnicity, if you will, of Nebuchadnezzar and his descendants. And this guy Nabonidus, who was really, Belshazzar really wasn't the king of Persia. He was Nabonidus' son, but Nabonidus worshipped the moon goddess named Sin instead of the Babylonian war god, which was Marduk. And that made him very unpopular with the people. And so he quite often left the city and left the empire in charge of his son Belshazzar. This man Nabonidus, quite interestingly, is known as the father of archaeology. Back in his day, he excavated many buildings and sites, especially around religious sites, and he displayed his finds in the earliest museums. But as I said, because his religious views were unpopular with the people in Babylon, he was often absent, and he leaves Belshazzar in power. Now, either way, during the time of Belshazzar's reign, a couple of things happened, and Tim just recently in the Bereans Bible Institute Revelation talked about the episode where Belshazzar is feasting. Where Tim is describing the whore of Babylon and the golden cup that she holds, and he connects this back to the golden cup and utensils of the temple that were misused and profaned by Belshazzar and his compatriots as they feast and get drunk. He said, I'll bring out all that stuff from Jerusalem. And they were drinking wine from it and getting drunk and carousing. And then the hand of God comes down and writes on the wall and says, paraphrasing, you've been weighed, you've been measured, and you've been found wanting. But either way, during Belshazzar's first year of reign, Daniel has his own vision of these empires, of these 4 Eurasian empires that are going, that represent, and they're represented by various animals. So, for example, and you can see this on the screen, he sees Babylon as a winged lion. He sees Persia as a ferocious bear, and these are the past and the current empires, respectively, from Daniel's perspective, because he was in the Persian Empire at that point. But he also has a vision of 2 animals that represent future empires. Greece, which was the next empire to rise, was seen as a 4-headed leopard. And the 4th beast, which is not named, it's just simply called the beast, was described as being different and more powerful than those that came before it. And this 4th beast represents both Rome as the eventual successor and conqueror of Greece, and with its 10 horns, it maps over to Nebuchadnezzar's idol and the 10 toes, and it represents the revived Roman Empire under the Antichrist at the time of the end. And so there's some dual imagery and prophetic references here. Then in Daniel chapter 8, and I want you to go to Daniel chapter 8 now, we see another glimpse of Greece and Persia, specifically just those 2. But this time they're described not as a leopard and a beast, or sorry, leopard and a bear. They're described as a goat and as a ram. And I want you to stop and ask yourself right now, ask yourself why. Ask yourself why do we get more detail on these 2 particular kingdoms? Why get more detail specifically? And what is he really focusing? Is Daniel really focusing, or the vision, is it really focusing more on Alexander the Great as the conqueror, as opposed to just giving more detail about the empire, the Persian Empire, that's on its way out and has already served its purpose? And actually, I think that is the right question to ask. What was the purpose of the Greek Empire in the story of God? We saw along in our studies and in the series, Tim's Revelation series, as well as this series, that God used Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar to bring judgment to his people for their disobedience over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. He also used the Assyrians for the same purpose. But, Persia specifically did God's will in returning the Jews and sponsoring the rebuilding of the temple after those 70 years in Babylon. In fact, in one verse, God calls Cyrus his anointed in the book of Isaiah. And in Greek, that word would be that Cyrus was God's Christ. And certainly not the same meaning that we talk about Jesus when we say Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. But it means that God chose Cyrus to fulfill a role. He had a specific purpose, which Cyrus gladly did. He gladly performed it, as opposed to Nebuchadnezzar, who swelled with pride and who was brought low when he said, look at all the things that I have built myself, when in fact he was given everything from God. So here we are in Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now these 2 horns represent the 2 different branches, if you will, of the Medo-Persian Empire, right? They were kind of coalesced, but they were under the banner of the Persians. This particular king, the one that gets conquered by Alexander the Great, his name is Darius III, and he's a successor to Darius the Great, who we have in past lessons just recently stated that he is Artaxerxes, that is a title that means king of kings. So Darius the Great is Artaxerxes, and he's probably king of Ahasuerus that we see in the book of Ruth. Let's continue on in verse 5. So that's the ram. The ram with the two horns is the Medo-Persian Empire. Verse 5, and as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth or the whole land without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Now this goat represents the Greek Empire, and the horn, which oftentimes symbolizes rule or authority or king or sometimes kingdom, represents Alexander the Great. And the fact that he was coming across the surface of the earth and he's not touching the ground implies the rapid nature. And the same thing where Alexander's empire is signified or symbolized as a four-headed leopard. They're known for their great speed. And Alexander the Great, his empire was formed over a period of about a decade, which is very, very quick. Verse 6, then he, and this is Alexander, came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. And in place of it, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And this refers to, and this is again documented historically, how after Alexander's death, and we'll go through this in a little bit more detail because there's some more color to the story than just simply making the statement that after Alexander died, his empire broke up into four pieces. Right? There's more detail and again more color to that. So historically, Alexander defeated Darius III after several battles. They didn't have one battle and all of a sudden things were over. This happened over a period of several years and several specific events. And to quickly answer that question, what purpose did Alexander and the Greek Empire serve in the broader story of God? I believe it was to eventually Hellenize the Jews. It was to set up the conditions for Antiochus Epiphanes, who's the one that's noted in verse 9 there, the little horn that grew exceedingly great toward the south. And the story of Antiochus Epiphanes brings us to the Maccabean revolt and the defiling of the temple, the abomination of desolation. And that whole story sets the precedent and the pattern for Rome and eventually the Antichrist kingdom at the time of the end. And all of these things are tied up together in historical events as well as in prophecy. And the prophecy is embedded into the history. But I believe that is and was the purpose of Alexander and his kingdom, was to bring Greek thought, culture, and philosophy into the Middle East throughout the land to set the stage for what needed to happen so that when the Messiah came, he would accomplish his task. And part of that was to visit the leadership, to assess the quality of their leadership. But certainly now we narrow the focus down to he had to die on a cross so that we could have propitiation for our sins. So before we get to the detail, I want to give you some highlights about Alexander the Great specifically. And Alexander was a Greek, of course, but Greece for a long time was not a unified country. Before what's called the classical period of Greece, what's called the archaic period, Greece was really, the country itself was divided geographically, it was divided politically. It was made up mostly, as you can see on the screen there, of city-states and you'll recognize these names, like cities like Sparta or areas like Sparta, Athens, Corinth. But these city-states that were independent of each other, but unified ethnically at the very least, they were separated by either oceans or mountain ranges. And so Greece was initially this collection of separate city-states as well as tribal regions that were constantly at war with each other because there was no central alliance. Now, prior to the rise of Alexander the Great, there were two Greco-Persian wars that were about a decade apart or so. And we're talking about somewhere around 500 years before Christ, right? And this is, several decades after the release of the Jews under Cyrus. So Greece and Persia again being the dominant power at this point, being the ram with the two horns, circa 500 BC, had a couple of classic wars. In the first war, Athens defeated the larger and the much more powerful Persian army of Darius the Great, the one that we've studied in the past. Athens defeated Darius the Great in what's called the Battle of Marathon. And that proved that the Persians could be defeated. And I think it bolstered the confidence of the country itself. But, here on an interesting side note, as the Athenians sought to control the movement of the Persians, they sent a runner 140 miles from where they were massing for war all the way down to Sparta, which you can see is down on the southern end of that part of the continent there. And he was seeking help from the Spartans. The Athenians and the Spartans were really no friends of each other, but sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so Athens sent a runner a very long distance that he covered over only a couple of days, apparently, according to history and legend. But the Spartans said, no, fight the Persians yourself. And the truth is that the Athenians were successful in Marathon. And after the war was over, they sent another runner from Marathon to go back to Athens, and the distance is about 25 miles or so, to announce their victory. And the story goes that the runner runs into the palace or wherever it is he went, and he proclaimed, "We've won," and then he died of exhaustion. But interestingly enough, and this is the side note, is that when the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens in 1886, 96, somewhere around there, the organizers wanted to commemorate some of the great events, and they looked at this historical run from Marathon to Athens, and hence we have the marathon, which is a 26.2 mile race, which roughly mimics the distance between Marathon and Athens, but it harkens back to this first Greco-Persian War around 500 BC. Now, not long afterwards, there's the second Greco-Persian War, where Darius's son Xerxes sought once more to control the Greeks, and he fought against King Leonidas of Sparta in the famous Battle of the 300 Spartans. And that's a whole story by itself that we're not going to go into, but Leonidas was killed in that battle about 480 BC, and then the Persians, being victorious, continued to march throughout the Greek land and conquering city after city. And these city-states continued to fall to the Persian Empire, but eventually the Greeks got together and said, "This is ridiculous, let's make peace with the Persians." And so there was a period of relative peace between Greece and Persia after these two very famous Greco-Persian wars. Now, about 100 years after these wars, Macedon, and you go back to the map there, you see Macedon in that blue-purple area up to the north. Macedon, which initially was this kind of small backwater country bumpkin area, they became a military and political power under a king by the name of Philip II, and he lived about 350 years before Christ. And King Philip, he defeated Corinth, he defeated Athens, he defeated Sparta, and he formed what was called the League of Corinth, which was the first time in that period of time where Greece was united. And this period kind of began the transition out of the archaic period into what's known as the classical Greek period. And Philip, after he united the Greeks in the League of Corinth, he began plans to invade Persia. He was very ambitious, at least the western portions. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to free Greeks who were living under Persian rule at the furthest reach of Persian influence, right? So he looked at the westernmost part of Persia and said, well, they probably have the least control over this area. Let me go free our people. Now, things went well until he was assassinated, and he was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguard, and the people that he had been trying to free rebelled, and they revolted, and they sided with the Persians, and that was kind of the end of that. But Philip had a son. He had a son named Alexander, who was 19 or 20 years old at that time, and he immediately became king. And in his first year, he not only relaunched his father's campaign against Western Persia, he had to put down rebellion among several other Greek regions. And this is just kind of the story of humanity. It doesn't matter what kingdom or empire you think about or talk about. Typically, when a king dies, there's a lot of tussling to figure out who's going to be in control of the throne. But with Alexander, who actually technically was Alexander the Third, he's the one that we call Alexander the Great. At 20 years old, he was no stranger to war. In fact, at age 16, his father had gone to war against what would later be called Constantinople, far to the east. And he left Alexander at 16 years old. He left him in charge as regent. And in Philip's absence, the northern tribes of Thrace, again, you can see Thrace on the screen there, very at the top in the middle. The northern tribes in Thrace rebelled against Alexander, and Alexander very quickly put down their rebellion, and he populated that area with Greek-speaking people, and he founded a city up there called Alexandropolis. It was at 16 years old. Now, Alexander had grown up in the courts of Macedon, where King Philip, his father, had hosted exiles from other countries, including Persia, and undoubtedly Philip learned about the inner workings of the Persian Empire. This was probably educated or brought into the education of Alexander as well. And in fact, from the ages of 13 to 16, young Alexander was tutored by none other than the Greek philosopher and scientist Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, his teacher was a man named Plato, and together Aristotle and Plato are considered to be the fathers of Western civilization, because all of the writings on politics and logic and ethics were incorporated into what even today would be the fabric of Western civilization, politics, and society, including here in the US and Canada, the European community. Now, both Aristotle and Plato had significant influence on the early church through the Gnostics, which we've taught about before. And these Gnostics taught a fusion of Christianity and Greek philosophy, which was basically paganism, right? You take Christianity and mix it with anything, it's no longer Christianity. Around the time of the Nicene Council, which is in the early 4th century AD, we can see the influence of Aristotle and Plato in the Roman Catholic doctrines that were hammered out at the Nicene Council, things like the Trinity, the immortality of the soul, even heavenly destiny. They kind of rooted, or they are rooted in Aristotelian and Platonic writings. In the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church embraced Platonic educational techniques in their universities and in their seminaries. And this is the kind of force of education, if you will. Now, let me say it this way. Alexander was heavily influenced by all of this writing and the teaching of Greek philosophy and culture, and his Greek worldview eventually formed the backdrop of the world that Christ was born into. Young Alexander was a brilliant military strategist, and he was, even today, he's still considered one of the greatest military minds in all of world history. And as soon, as I said a moment ago, as soon as he became king, he relaunched his father's campaign against Western Persia and simultaneously was putting down these rebellions among other Greek regions. So King Alexander takes the reins at the age of 20, and he pushes eastward, taking away the westernmost parts of the Persian Empire. And over the next decade, he battles the Persians on many occasions, and he continues to work his way. And you can see on the map there, if you start up in the top left with Macedonia and follow the arrow, this tracks Alexander's movements across the continent. He goes across Asia Minor. So he works his way across western Syria, then down the western Mediterranean. He takes the coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon, which were very important naval towns and even shipping towns, commerce. he eventually makes his way down to Egypt, and then he comes back up through the Middle East, and he crosses Assyria, captures Babylon, and he pushes into eastern India. And along the way, in the year somewhere around 331 BC, he defeats Darius III of Persia for the final time and takes final control of the Persian Empire. And he takes Babylon, and then he goes into Persia, into Susa, and he confiscates the Persian treasury. And at this point of 331 BC, which is really not that long before the time of Christ, we see this massive transition of power out of the Persian Empire into the hands of Alexander the Great and the Greeks. But for all of the tales of Alexander's greatness, his military prowess, he was a brutal man in war. As soon as he assumed the throne, he had all of his political rivals executed. And in one particular protracted siege of the city of Tyre, which was a very important from a military as well as an economic and I guess naval perspective, Tyre along the coast of the Mediterranean, not far from Jerusalem, in a protracted siege that took a couple of years. When it was all said and done, the entire population of the city was wiped out. There's another story of when he was pushing into India, and he comes up against this walled city, and the king of the city is standing on top of the wall, and he's defying Alexander. And according to these, and I think this is more legend than anything else, but that's my personal opinion, Alexander commands some of his soldiers to line up in single file and march one by one off the edge of a cliff. And so one after another, they obediently step off the ledge, they plunder their death. And when the 11th man approaches, Alexander yells, "Halt!" And he looks up to the king, who upon seeing Alexander's resolve and the men's faithful allegiance unto death, immediately surrendered without fighting a battle. And again, it's things like this that you read about in history and you wonder, are they really true? Maybe there's a version of the story that's true. But that's some of the big picture commentary about how Alexander rose to power and how he conquered the Persians. But where do the Jews fit in all this? Because as we have already demonstrated over the generations, even back in the times of the wicked kings of Judah, Judah was at the mercy of the northern kingdoms, the southern kingdoms. They were a vassal state in many cases. Historical and not just secular historical accounts, but Jewish records vary. But there is this one story where Alexander, as he was marching across the continent, conquering everybody, that at night he would have visions or dreams of a man that would tell him he was going to ride to victory every time that he went into war. And so one story says that he went to Jerusalem personally as he made his way through the Middle East, and he was met at the gates of the city by a high priest named Simon the Just. And he was the last survivor, apparently, of what's called the Great Council, which was the precursor to the Sanhedrin or the Knesset. And Alexander, being met at the gates by this high priest Simon the Just, according to the story, when the two met, Alexander actually bowed down to Simon the Just. And he said, "When I saw your face, I realized that you were the face that I'm seeing in my dreams." And so he had immediate respect, and he was awestruck. And Jerusalem apparently struck an accord with Alexander that allowed for peace, allowed for some degree of autonomy, but the price was that they had to become a vassal state of the Greeks. Same story, different actors. Having said that, some records state that Simon the Just was born a few decades after Alexander died. So again, we take some of these stories with a grain of salt. Now, what we do know about Alexander, some of the details, like he died without an heir. It doesn't mean he didn't have children, but around 323 BC, he became gravely ill. Again, another account says Alexander, being a young man, liked to drink a lot with his friends, and after one hard night of partying, he fell ill and died 10 days later. He just never recovered. When he died, he had at least 3 wives. Several of them were not Greek. They were of various degrees of Persian descent. And this was just kind of what was done back then. When you became the emperor and you conquered a territory, you married the king's daughter or something like that, just to make sure that you had some kind of a family connection and an ethnic connection, if you will, or at least your ancestors, your descendants would, to the people that you had just conquered. But one of those three wives was a Persian woman named Roxana, who was 3 months pregnant at the time that Alexander died. And as soon as she heard about Alexander's death, she murdered two of the other wives, and 6 months later bore Alexander a son. And it seems, according to the accounts, that either he was killed, he grew up and never challenged the throne, or he was considered an illegitimate child and not even Alexander's son anyways. But nevertheless, when Alexander died, he had no heir apparent, even though one of his wives was pregnant. But apparently on his deathbed, when he was asked who should succeed him on the throne, he simply said, "the strongest." And this is where we now start getting into the story of how the Greek Empire broke down and was split up into parts. Because as soon as Alexander died, immediately the throne was contested. Alexander's top general, a general named Perdiccas, claimed that he wanted to wait to see if Roxane's baby was a boy, which indeed he was. But in the meantime, Perdiccas became the supreme commander of the military and the regent of the whole empire, right? Ruling under the assumption that Roxana is going to have a boy and he'll eventually become king. Well, you know how that goes. He murdered a bunch of his potential rivals. He assumes full control. He splits the empire among close to a dozen of his military supporters. But one of those supporters is a general named Ptolemy, who had been granted control over the region of Egypt. Now, Ptolemy, very quickly after he was granted Egypt, he revolted, and Perdiccas invaded Egypt, but in the battle he was killed somewhere around 320 BC. And so we have Alexander dying, Perdiccas rising, killing rivals, assuming the command of the army and the throne. He divvies up the nation into a dozen or so more parts. Then Egypt and the Ptolemies revolt. Perdiccas comes down to try to stop the revolt, but he dies. And so what that's left is there's no supreme commander and there's no emperor anymore. All we have is an empire that's broken up into about a dozen different pieces. And so fighting among these regional leaders continued over many, many years until the region that was split among a dozen or so people started to coalesce. And eventually there was a period of time where all of the empire was controlled by 4 different generals, and they would be Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And this ultimately fulfills Daniel's prophecy, where he first saw Greece as a 4-headed lion, and then he saw Greece as a he-goat with a single horn, that when he ran into the ram and killed it, his horn broke apart into 4 pieces. Right? That single horn, after defeating the ram, became 4 pieces. So we go from Alexander to Perdiccas to 12 or so regional leaders. Perdiccas dies, and then 4 of the generals become the dominant powers. But among those 4, 2 are even more dominant still. And so after decades of continued fighting, eventually Ptolemy in the south and Seleucus in the north became the sole controllers or the sole authorities in the northern and the southern parts of the kingdom. So the north belonged to Seleucid. This is the area we would call today Syria. And he inherited the Levant, the kind of the Fertile Crescent, the Asia Minor, Syria, Mesopotamia. He founded what is called the Seleucid dynasty, from which we would see later Antiochus Epiphanes. He would later come. And in the south, Egypt, that had gone to Ptolemy, he founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, which we associate with the pharaohs of Egypt. And, these two, the north and the south, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, were constantly at war with each other over decades and decades and decades, with Israel right in the middle of the battlefield. Over the next century, Israel would sometimes lean towards the south in Egypt. Other times it would lean towards the Seleucids in the north. These two generals, Ptolemy and Seleucid, controlled the two halves of the empire. They weren't Alexander, who was not just a great military mind. He was the driving force behind the Hellenization of the entire known world. Right? So these Seleucid and Ptolemy were not Alexander, and they knew it, and the people knew it. And so what ended up happening is that both Ptolemy in the south and in Egypt and Seleucid in the north in Syria, they did everything that they could to continue to propagate Alexander's spread of Greek culture, of Greek customs and language. And again, this is what we call Hellenism. And the Greek culture under Alexander and then his two generals, ultimately, Seleucid and Ptolemy, that Greek culture became deeply embedded into the entire European continent, and it would eventually heavily influence the Jews, particularly under the period of time where they were held under the sway of the Seleucids, because again, sometimes they went back and forth. Now, there are a couple of very important things that happened during the period of time where the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were in control of the two halves of the ancient empire. I don't know if you can see that, if it's large enough on the screen there, but in the south, under the Ptolemies in Egypt, around 280 BC, Ptolemy II founded the library at Alexandria. We've talked about this in many different cases, but it was after the founding of the library at Alexandria that Ptolemy II, at about 250 BC, asked 70 Jewish scribes to translate the Torah into Greek. And this is where we get the Septuagint. This is the Old Testament translation that Jesus himself quoted from, that the apostles quoted from. And during this period of time, Jerusalem was under the control of Egypt and the Ptolemies, and they perpetuated Alexander's tolerance of the Jewish worship system and gave them some degree of autonomy. As long as they behaved themselves and paid their taxes, then everything was pretty much fine. But, that would change probably 30, 40 years later, somewhere around 198 BC, when again the Seleucids and the Ptolemies went to war, and the Seleucids gained control of the land of Israel. And they too continued Alexander's policy of relative tolerance, behave yourself, pay your taxes, and everything's going to be fine. You can do whatever you want. So going forward a little bit, now we're starting to get quite a bit closer to stories that we begin to attach to the time of Christ. So sometime around 168 BC. Now think about that. That's not all that long, right? We've been, not trapped is the wrong word, but we've been deep in the Old Testament stories, talking about events that happened 2,000, 2,500 years before the time of Christ. And now here we are, and we're just a century and a half before Christ. We've seen Babylon fall. We've seen Persia rise. We saw Greece rise. Now Greece is getting to the point where it will eventually start to disintegrate. And that's going to be a story for the next lesson. But here we are in the year 168 BC. Seleucids in the north, Ptolemies in the south. The Seleucid king now is a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. And once again, he's going to war against Egypt. But as he approaches the city of Alexandria, which of course was founded by King Alexander as he swooped down into Egypt and took control of that, as Antiochus Epiphanes was approaching Alexandria, he was met by a senator from the Republic of Rome. Now, Rome at this point wasn't an empire yet. It was a republic. But back in the time of Alexander, and again, like 150 or so years prior, Rome was a backwater. But by this time, Rome had grown from a small kingdom of no geopolitical consequence to a very large republic governed by elected officials, senators and consuls, with a substantial military. They were very powerful, and they were rising. This Roman senator, I believe his name was Populus, he famously confronted Antiochus Epiphanes. And the story goes that when the two met each other in this sandy strip, maybe it was along the coast, that Antiochus Epiphanes puts his right hand out to greet the senator or the consul, and instead of shaking his hand, he takes the tablet on which the Roman Senate's decree was written, and he put it in Antiochus's hand, and he draws a circle around Antiochus Epiphanes with his cane. And he tells Antiochus Epiphanes to read the will of the Roman Senate, which basically says, if Antiochus Epiphanes wants to go to war with Egypt, then we'll go to war with Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus said, well, let me withdraw and talk to my advisors. And the Roman senator, the consul, said no. Said, before you step out of that circle, you tell me what I should tell the Roman Senate. And so Antiochus Epiphanes capitulated, and he goes back to Syria, or at least heads back that way. And this is where we get the phrase, a line drawn in the sand. I know we've shared that in a couple of other sermons before, but it's interesting to take things that we know about in our day and phrases like that we use and go, okay, well, now I know in history where that happened and what actually that means. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes knew that war with Rome was a war he couldn't win, especially when he was engaged with Egypt at the same time. Now, what was happening back in Jerusalem? Because ultimately, if we just go through this history lesson, it's just kind of neat to know all these details and fun. But ultimately, what we want to know as Christians and disciples is, how does this impact the story of Christ or the story of God? So back in Jerusalem, which remember was under Seleucid control at this point, rumors had started to spread that Antiochus had died. Now, he hadn't. He was alive. And he was kind of on his way back from Egypt, heading north towards Syria. And so what ended up happening, you know what, I think, just give me 1 second. Oh, sorry, I just scrolled ahead too fast. So these rumors that that Antiochus had died had reached back to Jerusalem. Now, at this point in Jerusalem's history, there were two main factions among the Jews. There were those who embraced Hellenism and had adopted Greek ways of life and were mixing the profane with the holy. And then there was those who were more conservative, who remained loyal to the law and to Jehovah. And years earlier, under Antiochus's reign, he had ousted the rightful priest, a man named Jason, and replaced him with his own high priest, who was a Hellenist named Menelaus. So when Jason, who was the kind of the rebel, and he was not in Jerusalem, when he heard that Antiochus was dead, now it wasn't right. When he heard that Antiochus was dead, he musters a small army and he attacks Jerusalem, because Jerusalem, of course, would have had a contingent of a Greek army there just to make sure that they kept the peace and to enforce whatever they needed to enforce. So when news of that rebellion reached back to Antiochus as he was heading back to Syria just from getting his tuchus whooped by the Roman senator, he was defeated, he was embarrassed, he was frustrated. So he decided to go into Jerusalem and he was going to take care of business. And this is where we get the story of the Maccabean revolt and the story of Hanukkah. And on your own, it might be a good idea to read Daniel chapters 8, 10, and 11. All of the references in those chapters to the kings of the south, or the king of the south and king of the north, from an historical perspective, refer to the Ptolemy in Egypt and the Seleucids in the north, specifically Antiochus Epiphanes. And prophetically, some of these passages point, forward to the time of the end of the Antichrist. And Tim details this in our Daniel series that's online. So in the story of the Maccabean revolt, and remember where somewhere around 168 BC, we have not only had Jason come back and tried to take back the city so he could serve as the rightful high priest, but now Antiochus Epiphanes he's just mad, he's angry, he comes in and he just cleans house. He starts basically what ends up being a guerrilla warfare war, but he commits the abomination of desolation. He desecrates the temple, and he forces Jews to embrace Greek culture and Greek worship. Put a statue of Zeus in the temple. Now, for 3 years, from 168 to 165 BC, this Levitical family, the Maccabees, led an army of guerrillas, if you will, who for 3 years harassed the Seleucid army with hit-and-run tactics in the mountain regions of Judea. And eventually Antiochus said, this isn't worth it. And he gives up and he pulls his troops out. And then the Maccabeans come back and they cleanse the temple, and we have they restore temple worship, and we have the story of Hanukkah, as I mentioned just a moment ago. But they're doing this in the midst of a Hellenized population, the grip of Alexander, the grip and the influence of Greek culture and philosophy and even worship had infiltrated the culture and the thought process of the Jews. And this was part of the world that Jesus was born into. Fast forward to 140 BC. Simon Fasci, who was the brother of Judah Maccabee, who was known as the Hammer, Judah Maccabee. Simon Fasci founded what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. And this is a line of priest kings. Now remember, Judah has not had a king for 600 or more years. Quite a bit, long time. So the Hasmonean dynasty was a priest-king dynasty where the high priest ruled as king. And they ruled in Jerusalem under, semi-autonomous control with the Seleucids that were, they were still in control for the most part. But at this point, the Roman Republic was beginning to chip away at the western part of the Seleucid Empire. Just like the Greeks did to the Persians, the Romans were now doing this to the Greeks. The Greek Empire was embroiled in, multiple civil wars that further fractured the control and the integrity of the empire itself. And, for a very brief period of time, Israel and the Hasmoneans functioned as an entirely independent state. There was, we talked in past about the United Kingdom during the time of David and Solomon. And then from Rehoboam and Jeroboam forward, we talk about the divided kingdom. Then we have the return from Cyrus. Well, there's a very brief period of time where we have the independent kingdom, where Judah and Israel did not answer to either Seleucids or to the Ptolemies in Egypt. They controlled their own fate, but for a very, very short period of time, because as the Roman Republic was chipping away at the Seleucid Empire, the Roman Empire was beginning to expand, and by about 100 years before Christ, the Seleucid kingdom had contracted to just a small shadow of its former greatness. It was a region, at this point, 100 years before Christ, the great Greek Empire, the Seleucid dynasty and empire, really was made up of the city of Antioch and a handful of Syrian cities. Fast forward about 40 years or so, in AD 63 years before Christ, the Seleucid Empire fell in finality. The army of the Roman Republic, under the command of a general named Pompey, who was known as Pompey the Great, he was the one who antagonized Julius Caesar prior to the Republic converting into an empire. Pompey the Great, in 63 AD, it was 63 AD, he besieged the city of Jerusalem for 40 days until eventually the city capitulated. Now, this is a story for our next session, and I think I'm going to end today's lesson right here. But while Alexander's empire eventually disintegrated, his influence through Hellenization continued on. And certainly for the time shortly after and through the Roman period of control, Jerusalem and Israel, Jews, Jewish thought, Jewish culture was still very much influenced by Greek philosophy, culture, thought, and religion. And we can see the battle that the apostles and the early church fathers had. They were still battling the influence of Greek thought 100 years or so after Christ. We see the evidence of that in the writings of, people like Irenaeus. And I would argue that we fight against the influence of Alexander even today. When we look at the modern church and we look at modern theology and doctrine, and we look at how far away from the pristine faith that was handed down once for all by the apostles, how far away from that we've come. And, the more we do studies like this, the easier it is for us to pick apart the origins and the nature of the things that are being taught in modern Christian churches. So while this may seem to have been a little bit of a long-winded history lesson, first of all, I hope it was enjoyable. To me, it's neat to see the historical sequencing and to be able to plug names and relative dates and time periods into that gap of time between the return from Babylon and the era of the New Covenant. Right? It's a big gap that really isn't talked about all that much. At least it hasn't been with things that I've been exposed to. But the bottom line is this, is that, I asked the question, what purpose did Alexander serve? I think the main purpose was to position the world and bring influences to bear against the leadership of Israel, so that when Christ came, they would be blinded to who he was. As the scripture says, they were blinded in part. And we know that the scripture teaches that they were blinded so that they would crucify him. Because had Christ not crucified, he couldn't have risen from the dead. And if he hadn't risen from the dead, hello, Feast of First Fruits, then where would we be? Our faith would be in vain. So we'll leave it there today, and we'll have another video coming up pretty soon where we'll talk about the rise of the Roman Empire and then the geopolitical circumstances determined by Rome and the world that Jesus was brought up in. God bless. Talk to you soon.